It was the small porcelain bird, the one with the chipped wing, that started it all. It always sat on the mantelpiece above the fireplace in their living room, even after all the other trinkets had been packed away for renovations. A silent, constant fixture. No one ever touched it. No one ever commented on its flaw, not even when the dust gathered thick around its base. It was just there, a quiet sentinel to decades of unspoken things. I remember seeing it that night, glinting faintly in the soft lamplight, the tiny fracture in its wing almost imperceptible unless you knew to look. And I always knew to look. If this sounds like your silence, stay. You don't owe them your forgiveness, not anymore. And if you know a woman who carried too much for too long, give her this story. He sat across from me, his hands clasped, the knuckles pale. 40 years. 40 years since that night. And he started by talking about the weather, about the price of gas, anything but the air thick between us. He always did that circle and loop like a bird trying to find its nest in a storm. And for a second, no one said a word. I just watched him, the lines around his eyes deeper now, the tremor in his voice a little more pronounced. Time had etched its story on him, just as it had on me. But my story was etched on the inside, a quiet burn. My best friend Eleanor had been gone for 5 years then. 5 years of her absence creating its own kind of presence, a hollow space that hummed with all the things left unsaid. He had called me out of the blue after all that time, his voice thin and reedy, asking if I would come over just for a cup of tea. He said he had something to tell me, something that had been weighing on him. I knew even before I stepped foot in that house that it was about Eleanor. It was always about Eleanor, even when it wasn't. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. He finally looked at me, truly looked, and his gaze was like a key turning in a rusted lock. She knew, didn't she? He whispered, his voice barely audible. It wasn't a question. It was a confession laid bare after 4 decades. Knew what he didn't need to say it. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of that unspoken truth. The truth that had festered between us, a silent gangrene eating away at the edges of our lives. He was talking about the secret, the one we had all carried, or rather the one I had carried, believing I was protecting her, protecting them. I remember her face that night, pale under the porch light, her eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears. She had hugged me fiercely, a desperate cling, and whispered, "Please don't tell him. Not now. Not ever." And I, young and foolish and loyal to a fault, had promised. A promise that became a stone in my gut, growing heavier with each passing year. A promise that cost me more than I could ever have imagined. He, her husband, stood in the doorway, a shadow against the light, his back to us, oblivious. Or so I thought. She knew, he repeated, a tear finally tracing a path down his weathered cheek. She knew what you did for her, what you kept for her. My breath caught. All these years I had believed I was carrying her burden alone, that I was the sole keeper of that painful silence. And he had known, all along he had known. The chipped bird on the mantelpiece seemed to hum with the echoes of that revelation, a tiny, fractured witness to a truth finally breaking free. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. His eyes, still fixed on mine, held a strange mix of regret and relief. She never said anything, not directly. He continued, his voice steadier now, as if the first confession had cleared a path. But there were things, little things. A look, a silence when certain topics came up. She would flinch just a fraction when someone mentioned that summer. And she stopped going to the lake, her favorite place. Said the water felt cold now. He paused, and for a second, no one said a word. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, listening. I remembered the lake, the shimmering blue expanse where we'd spent every summer of our childhood, our laughter echoing across the water. After that night, Eleanor never swam again. She'd sit on the shore, wrapped in a towel, even on the hottest days, watching us with an unreadable expression. I had attributed it to a fear of the water, a sudden aversion. But now, seeing the quiet sorrow in his eyes, I understood. It wasn't the water she feared. It was the memory submerged within it. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. She carried it too, didn't she? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My own words felt fragile, like old paper. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the mantelpiece, towards the chipped porcelain bird. Every day, I saw it in her eyes. It was like a shadow always there, just behind her smile. He finally looked back at me, a direct, unflinching gaze. And I pretended not to see it, for years. Because if I acknowledged it, then I would have to acknowledge everything else. His voice trailed off, lost in the labyrinth of his own unspoken past. The truth, when it finally emerged from the quiet corners of that living room, wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a lament, a soft, sorrowful song of what had been lost. He spoke of the guilt he had carried, the quiet resentment not towards me, but towards the truth itself. The truth that had reshaped their lives, the one he had chosen to ignore for the sake of a fragile peace. He had seen my burden, my silent suffering, and had done nothing. Not out of malice, he insisted, but out of a profound, cowardly love for Eleanor. He had wanted to spare her more pain, even if it meant letting me bear the weight of it all. And for a second, no one said a word. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, not in that moment. It was a strange kind of release, like watching a heavy curtain slowly lift after decades. The air in the room, once so thick with unspoken things, began to thin to breathe. His confession, though delayed, was a recognition, a silent nod to the years I had spent holding that secret, not just for Eleanor, but for the stability of their world. He hadn't known the full extent of my sacrifice, he claimed, but he had known enough. And that was the quiet horror of it, the subtle complicity of silence. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. His gaze was fixed on the chipped bird again, almost as if he were seeing it for the first time. She never forgave herself, he murmured so softly I almost didn't catch it. For what happened, and for what she asked of you. The weight of those words settled between us, heavy and immutable. All these years I had held on to the belief that I was protecting her, shielding her from the fallout. But she had been carrying her own silent burden, a mirror image of mine, crafted from the same fractured truth. And for a second, no one said a word. It was a strange comfort, in a way, to know that the solitude of my secret was in fact shared. Not that it lessened the ache, but it changed its quality. It became less about my personal sacrifice and more about the pervasive, insidious nature of secrets within families, how they ripple outwards, touching everyone, even those who claim not to know. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the echoes of two lives shaped by an unspoken agreement, a quiet pact born of fear and misguided loyalty. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. He then started to recount small details, fragments of memories that in retrospect painted a clearer picture of Eleanor's inner turmoil. The way she'd sometimes stare out the window for long periods, her eyes distant. The times she'd abruptly change the subject if the conversation veered too close to that summer. How she'd become increasingly protective of her privacy, her diary locked away, her phone always face down. Things I had dismissed as quirks of her personality, or the natural progression of age, now coalesced into a mosaic of a woman haunted by a truth she couldn't share. It wasn't a dramatic unveiling, no sudden gasps or tears. It was a slow, deliberate peeling back of layers, like an archaeologist carefully unearthing a fragile artifact. Each word he spoke chipped away at the hardened shell of my own long-held assumptions. I had believed I was strong, that I could carry it, that it was my cross to bear. But in his quiet confession, I saw how that belief had also trapped me, preventing me from seeking solace, from truly healing. I had embraced the burden, mistaking it for strength. I didn't hurt them, I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. He finally reached out his hand, hovering for a moment, before gently resting on top of mine. His touch was light, almost tentative, a gesture of apology that had been 40 years in the making. I should have said something, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Years ago, I should have asked you, really asked you if you were all right. The words were simple, yet they landed with the force of a confession far grander. It wasn't about what happened that night anymore, not entirely. It was about the silence that followed the tacit agreement to pretend to look away, to let me carry what should have been shared. And for a second, no one said a word. The quiet in the room shifted, no longer heavy with unspoken words, but with the fragile possibility of understanding. It wasn't about absolution for him or for me. It was about acknowledgement, about finally seeing the intricate, painful web spun by a secret and the quiet damage it had wrought on all our lives. He spoke of his fear of disrupting Eleanor's fragile peace, of the careful edifice they had built brick by silent brick. And I understood. Not that it excused his inaction, but it explained the human frailty that underlay it. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. He recounted how Eleanor in her final days had often looked at him with a specific knowing sadness, a look he now interpreted as a plea, a silent wish for the truth to surface, for the burden to be lifted, not just from herself, but from me. She had been trapped by her own request, her own fear, unable to release the very secret she had asked me to keep. And I, in my unwavering loyalty, had only tightened the knot. We had all been complicit in our own quiet suffering. I looked at the chipped porcelain bird still on the mantelpiece, and for the first time it didn't look like a symbol of a broken past. It looked like something that had endured despite its flaw, like a witness that had finally found its voice through the tremor in his hands, the sorrow in his eyes. The weight I had carried for so long didn't vanish, not entirely, but it transformed from a crushing burden into a part of a shared history, finally acknowledged, finally seen. It was a gentle execution of a silent sentence. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. There was a lightness in the air, a subtle shift that felt like a quiet dawn after a long, dark night. He started to talk about Eleanor again, not about the secret, but about her laughter, her meticulous garden, the way she hummed off-key when she cooked. These were the memories that had been obscured, buried under the weight of what was unspoken. Now they began to emerge fresh and vibrant, as if the truth had acted as a solvent washing away the decades of grime. And for a second, no one said a word. It was a strange form of healing, this conversation. Not a dramatic reconciliation, but a quiet unfurling. The porcelain bird on the mantelpiece seemed less fragile now, more resilient, a small testament to enduring through fracture. I realized then that the burden wasn't truly gone, but it was no longer mine alone. It had become a shared understanding, a quiet grief, and a solemn witness to the intricate, often painful dance of human connection. The ending wasn't a sudden burst of light, but a gentle fading of the long shadow. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. He stood up finally and walked over to the mantelpiece. He picked up the bird, turning it gently in his hands, his thumb tracing the line of the chipped wing. His eyes were soft, distant, lost in a memory only he could see. He didn't say anything more about that night or about Eleanor's last days. There was nothing more to say. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or laden with secrets, but peaceful, a quiet acceptance of what had been and what now was. The decades of carefully constructed walls had finally crumbled, not with a crash, but with a whisper. I didn't hurt them, I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me.